Tonight, an Idaho Report special edition, The Russians. Beyond that famous and imposing wall lies the Kremlin, the seat of power and government in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, the world's other great superpower, a country and a political system that the United States finds itself at odds with on nearly every issue in every corner of the globe. Most Americans know, of course, that the future peace and stability of the world depends on how the two superpowers manage their relationship. At the moment, clearly, the relationship is badly strained. Even a first-time observer in this country knows that. But beyond that geopolitical fact, most Americans know very little about the Soviet Union, about what Soviets think and why, and how they live. Tonight, some observations. This is Red Square in Moscow. It is the major public area in the capital of the Soviet Union. It serves as a national town square of sorts. It is a place where we see on television the missiles and the banners as the Soviet Union parades its awesome military capability. It is an honored place to millions. The preserved remains of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, are displayed here. It is also a place where Muscovites bring their children for an afternoon outing in the summer. Most of these Russians would tell you, should you be lucky enough as a Westerner to get them to talk to you, that they are a people of peace, profoundly distressed that U.S.-Soviet relations have reached a state that some are calling the new Cold War. They would also tell you that the United States, and particularly Ronald Reagan, is to blame for that situation. The official Soviet line is that relations are very bad, and that makes things very dangerous. Valentin Bereshkov is a prominent Soviet journalist. He edits a magazine that covers U.S. politics and economics.
Now, as far as America is concerned, certainly I would say that now among Soviet people there is a great worry about the attitude of this administration. And certainly everybody is asking why this administration is trying to build up their military potential, why they are developing new weapon system, why they have renounced the SALT II treaty, why they don't want to ratify this treaty, why they don't want to stop tests of nuclear weapons, so it means that they want to develop new weapons. And this really looks to the Soviet Union, to the Soviet people, as something that is really threatening, looks threatening to the Soviet people. But on the other hand, I would say the general attitude towards American people is a positive attitude.
So while the official Soviet view has it that things wouldn't be so bad if the U.S. hadn't made them so bad, a quick review of recent history shows a much more complex bilateral collection of causes. The precipitous deterioration really goes back to 1979 and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviets say, of course, they were invited in. There followed in rapid order the Carter administration's withdrawal of the SALT II treaty, the U.S. grain embargo, the U.S. boycott of the Moscow Olympics, the rise of the Solidarity labor movement in Poland, new tensions in Central America, an assassination attempt against the Pope that some analysts now link to the Soviet KGB. Then there was the new deployment of Soviet SS-20 missiles in Eastern Europe and NATO's deployment in Western Europe of U.S. Pershing and cruise missiles. And finally, the Soviet walkout of arms control talks in Geneva. Add to all of that, during the last year, the Kremlin's refusal to take any responsibility for the Korean airliner shootdown, the Soviets' own Olympic boycott, and some of the president's hardline anti-Soviet rhetoric, and the picture is one of little optimism that relations will improve either very much or very quickly. Still, the typical Soviet citizen seems remarkably knowledgeable about many of these strains between the two major world powers. As a visitor, it's not uncommon to be asked a detailed question about, say, space weapon technology. But with a completely controlled press and television, there is no basis in the Soviet Union for a sanctioned debate about the substance of this country's policy. You will not hear a discussion about whether the Red Army should be in Afghanistan. So in many ways, well-established perceptions about this country are depressingly reinforced by a visit here. By our standards, the political and economic life of the Soviet Union is nothing short of stifling. Yet somehow the country and the people are not completely as we expect them to be. It is predictable that we are going to think of the Soviet Union as a closed, depressing society. And in some important and basic ways, it certainly is. But in other ways, it is far from the sterile, cold environment so often depicted. The arts seem to be given a high priority, with performances generally available to everyone. This national folk dance company has performed widely in the Soviet Union and in many Eastern Bloc countries. The group has not performed in the United States, perhaps because the Soviets have become increasingly concerned and embarrassed by the defection of their artists. The Russian circus is a national institution, and this crowd, mostly Russian parents with their children, obviously enjoyed the show. And while it's a safe bet that most of these Russians lead what by American middle-class standards must be considered a hard life, what with housing shortages and a lack of consumer goods, one sees no great or obvious discontent in their faces. The huge amounts of money diverted in this economy to military expenditures clearly squeezes the civilian economy. And while most Western observers feel the standard of living in the Soviet Union has leveled off after several years of sustained growth, the difficulty with shortages seems more or less to be accepted as part of the routine. A Russian making 150 rubles a month, about $200, will think little of spending more than half of that for a pair of Western-style jeans. The same Russian will think nothing at all of paying only 5 rubles a month for a small apartment in the Moscow suburbs. The Soviet consumer goods are of lower quality than ours, there is no doubt about that. And some things are impossible to buy at any price. But like people everywhere, Russians seem able to scratch and scrape and scheme to somehow get by. They do it with what amounts to a gritty determination. It is a belief, frankly, not much different than the American belief that with a little hard work, a little faith, a little luck, life will get better. And if things are tough now, well, we hope that they won't be so tough for our children. By design, the Soviet government labors hard to keep Western influences, clothing, music, certainly Western ideas, out of the country. One of the few Western items available here is a Pepsi-Cola, yet the natives seem to make do with a curious lemonade concoction dispensed from sidewalk vending machines, each person carefully washing the plastic glass and leaving it for the next in line. It's just one small example of the order and regimentation that dominates Soviet life. At 7:15 on a weekday morning, strangely enough, it is order, regimentation, quiet, and cleanliness that dominates the Moscow subway. A lot of things don't seem to work very well in this country. The subway is not one of them. The trains run on time, and one can ride anywhere in the capital for 7 cents. The stations are decorated with patriotic scenes, and they are immaculately clean. On this morning, the crowds were immense. But unlike, say, the New York subway, there is no graffiti, very little talking, and no fear of a mugger. Order is also the word to describe the residential neighborhoods of every major Soviet city. Huge amounts of housing were destroyed in the Soviet Union during World War II. Now, almost everyone lives in high-rise apartment complexes. Housing is still a problem despite much new construction, and the buildings are demonstrably ugly. Still, government housing projects here and government housing projects in the United States don't really look all that much different. No one here, save maybe a top government official or a factory manager, has the luxury of a yard or a garden. Because so many Soviet women are now in the workforce, daycare has become a necessity and the government provides. Nearly every major apartment complex has its own facility, this one in Minsk, a city of about 2 million. The suspicion is that we were shown a model facility. It seemed well equipped and well staffed, and the youngsters were certainly on their best behavior. The visiting Americans were treated to a performance that was, well, just about perfect. Large families used to be common in the Soviet Union. In the European part of the country, that is no longer true. The government, in fact, is deeply worried about a declining birth rate among the ethnic Russian population, while the Asian and Muslim population is soaring. There are tax incentives to encourage large families, and tax penalties assessed after a certain point if a young couple has not started a family. Talking to Russians casually on the street is always possible. The secret is to ask them first about their children. As an indicator of how completely the Communist Party dominates life in the Soviet Union, consider the wedding day of a young couple in Moscow. They will make two important stops after their wedding. They will come here to the Lenin Hills overlooking Moscow to gaze on the capital of the world's first Marxist-Leninist state. Later, like dozens of others who will be married in Moscow today, the newlyweds will lay flowers at the tomb of Lenin. Lenin remains 60 years after his death the principal symbol of the communist state. The party apparatus he helped create is the force that rules the state today and rules the Russian people. Kurt Kamen is the deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. He is, by virtue of long service in the Soviet Union, an American expert on the Soviet system. He provided a briefing in Moscow for the members of the Idaho Friendship Force.
The party is really supposed to take an interest in all elements of national life. And that party is expected not only to organize the political process, but to oversee all the activities of the country, including its foreign policy, the working of the economy, the behavior of youth. This has just been a topic that they've been pronouncing themselves on in the last few days. In that sense, it is more than a political body. It is, if you will, a way of life, or you might say it offers a code.
That party code is constantly reinforced through an overwhelming military and police presence. Uniforms are seen outside almost every building, and there is a steady sense that someone, somehow, is watching, always. The party runs everything, even the tourist attractions. In 1917, Russian sailors marched through this square in Leningrad to overthrow the government, which was meeting in the former Winter Palace of the Tsar. Today, the Winter Palace fills up with tourists who gawk at the treasures that once were the Tsar's. Tourism has become a major source of foreign currency, an item desperately needed to help fuel the Soviet economy in the world marketplace. In 1945, retreating Nazi troops blew up the fabulous fountains built by Peter the Great at Petrodvorets. The grounds have since been restored with a careful eye toward luring the foreign tourist, and most importantly, pocketing the foreign currency. The official Communist Party line celebrates the equality of Soviet women. It is true that many of the country's physicians are women. But it is also true that almost all of the most menial jobs in this society are performed by women for the lowest wages. In political terms, the party that runs the country is run by men. Men who can feel enough at ease even with Americans to make a joke when asked about the political influence of women in the Soviet system.
Well, part of the answer to your question would be that one of the deputies to the chairman of the Council of Ministers of this republic is a lady. We have 5 ministers in this republic who are ladies.
В городе один из районов возглавляет женщина, председатель исполкома, один из 9.
Then one of the 9 administrative districts of this city is administrated by a lady.
У нас по закону
Женщины, конечно, равноправны.
Well, our legislation would give an equal opportunity and right for a lady to be represented at the same level as a man can be. No restrictions.
Но они у нас тоже
But-
вежливые и часто уступают без...
Women here are really very polite to give their opportunity to men.
One opportunity the men who run the Soviet Union have only recently allowed women is a highly visible role in the international peace movement. Groups like the Soviet Women's Committee have over the last several years maintained at times what has been virtually the only dialogue between Soviets and Americans. Members of the Idaho Friendship Force delegation met with leaders of the women's group recently in Moscow. Despite their claims to the contrary, the women's groups are sanctioned and financed by the Soviet government. The design, clearly to influence foreign and domestic opinion, by driving home the notion that above all, the Soviets desire peace.
I am very happy that at the level of non-governmental organization, we always had a very good relationship. And for example, last year, in the period of this Korean aircraft problem, the worst period in the relationship between our countries, we were very happy that the relationship between women's organization never stopped. They continued, and not only continued, but they increased, I should say, these last 2 years. And it seems to me that it's a good sign because it shows that within the United States, there are really forces who understand the necessity of having a good relationship with our countries.
Two participants in this meeting, Ann Hausrath and Pat Hall, are members of the Boise Women for Peace, a group that in 1982 tried to foster better U.S.-Soviet understanding with a gift to the Soviet Union of a quilt, a peace quilt. The women came to the Soviet Union not knowing what had happened to their peace offering. The search to find out led to Vilnius, the capital of the Lithuanian Socialist Republic. To get here, a city near the Polish border about 1,000 miles from Moscow, required special travel permits which took weeks to arrange. The effort wound through a maze of the Soviet bureaucracy and around and sometimes through a language and cultural barrier. The effort provides a small but real lesson about how difficult it can be to arrange even the simplest dialogue in the midst of the chill in U.S.-Soviet relations. The Idaho group, which also included Lieutenant Governor David Leroy and Margaret Workman of the Friendship Force, was allowed only 24 hours in Vilnius, arriving with little idea of where to find the quilt or if it even existed. The first stop was at a major museum.
She's informed us that there is no museum in this city known as the Peace Museum. There are plans to build one, and there may be some materials collected for that museum, but it is not yet built, and there is no yet public display. However, she's checking with members of the committee, with members of the Department of Culture, and possibly with other museums to see if there may be something temporarily on display like the Boise Peace Quilt.
And I think we ought to try calling that committee and see what we can find out in terms of where it might be. And even though she says the Ministry of Culture has to approve it, I would bet if somebody knew you were here and had it in storage, they'd get it out so that it could be shown.
Well, even if they don't get it out, if I could talk to somebody who has been involved with the peace movement, this would help. Let's go to back to the hotel and talk to the service
Okay,
bureau.
I think anything connected with peace movement here, peace organization, Soviet Women's Peace Committee, or any other names, that we ought to go ahead and make 3 or 4 calls and see what we could find out.
Well, let's go to the service bureau first and then to one of the museums.
Okay.
When we made the quilt, it was a complete act of faith. We made it as a gesture of goodwill to the ordinary people of the Soviet Union. And now that we're here in the Soviet Union, being so close, we felt that if we could make the personal connection with the people who received the quilt, that we would have come full circle.
Many hours and many telephone calls later, the circle was completed.
И потом мы послали его по республике, он шел по республике, там, где бывали у нас женские организации.
The leader of the Lithuanian Women's Committee explained that the quilt had been displayed throughout Lithuania, and she apologized for the quilt having faded.
Thank you for making our trip to Lithuania such a happy one. And when you come to Idaho, we will do the same for you.
Спасибо большое, конечно.
A quilt that has been used means that it has been loved, one that is faded, and therefore is more valuable. This is mine.
Realizing that things are very different in this country, and it was not easy to do some of the things we had to do. Nonetheless, we ran into some incredibly supportive people who put in many hours of their own personal time in their attempts to help us with this crusade. The same type of effect that you might have gotten in the United States with a cause that seemed to mean something to some people.
I'm delighted, obviously. We started the quilt with hope of making people-to-people contact, and today we succeeded.
And the fact that we today could, after thousands of miles and hundreds of people hours of effort in tracking down this quilt, actually find a woman who cared for it as much as those who made it in Boise, tells me that we really do have some honest possibilities in this world for peace.
It would be unrealistic, of course, to think that a peace quilt and a little person-to-person goodwill can improve relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. Yet, in the current atmosphere of deep mistrust and fear, this little event represents something concrete. On this one Sunday afternoon in a place far away, some Americans came together with a Soviet citizen, and they shared something together. And that can't be bad.
Всех благ. Ждем вас.
So it is really something that was created by anti-Soviet propaganda that the Soviet Union is hostile to America, wants to destroy America, but actually this is not our aim. On the contrary, our aim is to have good relations with the United States, but only on the basis of equality and equal security and the attitude of two equally great powers, and this would be the basis of our relationship.
Valentin Berezhkov's belief really represents the major difficulty in attempting to sort out the tangle that today is U.S.-Soviet relations. It's really the country's belief fundamentally that the Soviet Union is a victim, that it is put upon by the West and threatened. It is a deep-seated paranoia that U.S. diplomat Kurt Kamen, who has watched the Soviets for years, expresses this way.
Going back to the Germans in World War II, Napoleon 150 years earlier, the Mongols in the 12th century, there have been numerous invasions that have caused them to be very leery of foreigners, and this is their habit.
It is easy, almost too easy perhaps, to pinpoint the things that Americans find wrong about the Soviet Union. It is a police state. It persecutes its own people. It dominates Poland and Afghanistan with an army far larger than it needs for its own self-defense. It is a society that refuses to examine itself. In fact, in 2 weeks in this country, I never once heard a substantive criticism of Soviet policies or actions. And all of that is worthy of our contempt. What is more difficult, but ultimately more important, is finding a means, somehow, to share this planet with these people, who, like us, possess the power to destroy the future. It is difficult to even acknowledge that our systems and values will likely be at odds for a long time, with there being little we can do about it. Yet our future, and theirs, depends on how well we both do the really difficult job of surviving. I'm Mark Johnson.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.